Whether it be a hard conversation later today or your retirement decades from now, future trouble is one of our chief sources of anxiety, worry, right? What does God's Word teach us about how to turn worry into hope? That's the topic of this session. In the heart of the Sermon on the Mount, right in the middle, Jesus devoted a lengthy section to this topic of anxiety in Matthew 6, verses 25 to 34. In that section, Jesus makes a very clear distinction between today's trouble and tomorrow's trouble. Matthew 6:34, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. So each day has its own trouble. Today's trouble is one thing, tomorrow's trouble is something else. And Jesus wants us to make that distinction in our minds. Worry is the decision to import tomorrow's trouble into today and suffer it prematurely. If the thing that you're worried about ends up happening, well, God's intention was for you to feel the pain of that trouble once when it happens. Not 10 times today and again when it happens. And then a lot of stuff we worry about never does happen. So if the thing never happens at all, then God's desire in that case was for you to suffer the pain of that trouble 0 times. Choosing to suffer ahead of time is needless, self-inflicted suffering. And for what? What good does it do? That's the point Jesus makes in verse 27, Matthew 6:27. He says, who of you by worrying can add a single hour to his life? The Holman translates that, who of you by worrying can add a single cubit to his stature. And there's debate about how to translate it, but whichever translation is correct, the point is the same. You could put anything in there. You can't accomplish anything good by worrying. Now, again, if it's something that calls for planning, then that's good anxiety. Go ahead and think about it. Let your anxiety energize you to give it lots of thought and do the necessary preparation, all that. But if there's nothing that can be done about it today, then worrying is folly. It's folly, and God forbids it. Matthew 6:34, Jesus says, flat out, do not worry about tomorrow. There are 2 aspects of the future that scare us. What we don't know and what we think we do know. The unknown is always frightening, and nothing is more hidden from our view than the future, right? We can't even see one moment into the future, and yet we're hurling into that unseen world at the rate of 24 hours per day. It's like driving a car with no brakes and the windshield completely covered. This is why mankind has always been attracted to divination. Divination is the effort to get some kind of supernatural glimpse into the future. Some way of knowing the future. Ancient techniques, they had all kinds of them. They ranged from casting lots to examining animal entrails and all the rest. Modern efforts are similar. Astrology, palm readers, tarot cards, crystal balls, whatever. No method has ever worked, but mankind keeps at it, keeps trying. Leo Oppenheim, one of the most distinguished experts in Near Eastern studies of his generation, studied ancient cuneiform writings of Sumeria, Assyria, and Babylon. And he estimated that, get this, 90% of all writings found, religious or secular, have to do with divination. 90%. There's something about divination, even secular writings. We want to know the future. We want to know what's going to happen, because if we could just get a hint of what's coming, well, we wouldn't be blindsided by trouble. We could prepare, or maybe even dodge those troubles altogether. If we could just see into the future, that would calm all our anxiety about the future, right? Or would it? Think of all the troubles you've endured over the past 12 months. All the hardships over the past year. If God would have come to you a year ago and put all that on a big screen, says, here's what's in store for you for the next year, would that have reduced your anxiety? Or would it have increased your anxiety 10 times? If you saw all the trouble that's in store for you just in the next 24 hours, you probably wouldn't get out of bed. So instead of telling us what's coming, God does something much better. He tells us what we need to know to prepare for what's coming. Matthew 6:33 says, seek first his kingdom. This is right in that section about anxiety. He says, and worry. Seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all that stuff will be added to you as well. Everything's going to work out. Everything you need tomorrow will fall into place if today you seek righteousness. You'll be ready. You'll be ready for whatever happens, so you can just sit back now and trust God and enjoy not having to carry the weight of tomorrow. Because with knowledge comes responsibility, right? If you knew everything, then you would have responsibility. If God showed you the future, that would be more pressure than God wants you to bear. So just enjoy not knowing the future. That's a blessing. You say, okay, that's great, but what about the things I can foresee? I mean, I may not know exactly what's going to happen, but in some cases I have a pretty good idea. I can see stuff coming. I don't have the details, but I can see trouble's coming, and it is scary. You believe that whatever God sends your way will be ultimately for your good. You understand that, but still, you're afraid. Well, how do you deal with that kind of worry? Well, remember, when it comes to fear, just ask yourself, what are you afraid of? Remember back in session 11, we found that we don't actually fear trouble. We don't even fear suffering. The thing we fear is unhappiness, right? If you're afraid of tomorrow, it's because you are imagining a version of tomorrow in which you will be unhappy. If you're worried about tomorrow, it's because you are imagining a version of tomorrow in which you are unhappy. Whether you've consciously thought of it in those terms or not, your soul believes that your happiness is on the line with this thing that's coming. Last time we talked about why God gives us the gift of imagination. Remember that? What we're supposed to do with imagination? One major reason God gave us the gift of imagination, the ability to do that, is to help our faith, right? To build our faith, to assist us in believing the things God tells us. Daydreaming about being happy in the midst of future trouble will help your soul believe that's possible. It'll create the neural pathways. Worry, which is daydreaming about unhappiness and future trouble, does the exact opposite. It destroys your faith. All daydreaming builds neural networks, always. So worry is a misuse of imagination because it trains your brain, your nervous system, and your soul to believe that if the worst happens, God won't be enough. That's what worrying trains you to believe. Now, it may feel like, you might hear that, it's like, fine, I don't want to worry, but I can't control it. It might feel like worry is outside of your control. It's not. It's not. Now, those thoughts might come up, but if your imagination insists on daydreaming about the most painful outcome tomorrow, that's okay. You can still guide that. You can still guide that. You can say, okay, so if you're so intent on imagining a painful tomorrow, fine, knock yourself out. But no matter how painful the scenario you dream up, I will commandeer that daydream and imagine myself being happy in the Lord throughout this ordeal that you're conjuring up. If you imagine yourself happy in the midst of that future trouble, that's not worry. That's not worry, and it won't cause anxiety. In fact, it will alleviate anxiety. It'll calm your fears. So Jesus forbids worry, and in the rest of that verse, verse 34, he gives a promise and a statement. Both the promise and the statement will help us a great deal in letting go of worry. So let's look first at the statement. The statement assures us that God is intentional about assigning the right amount of trouble to each of your days. Matthew 6:34, do not worry about tomorrow. Then here comes a statement. Each day has enough trouble of its own. The worrier looks to tomorrow and says, okay, I want that suffering now. They look at today's trouble and say, that's not enough. It's not enough. I want today's trouble and tomorrow's trouble. Give it to me all now. I got to have it all now. Worry is trouble greed. It's trouble greed. But Jesus says no. He places tomorrow's trouble off limits. We're not allowed to suffer that now. You have to wait until tomorrow for tomorrow's suffering, because today's suffering is just enough. It's just enough. God designed today's trouble to be just what you need today. It will test your faith. It will build your character in just the right ways for today. Tomorrow's trouble won't. It won't. If the doctor gives you some medicine and he says, take one of these pills each day, just one. If the doctor tells you that, don't take 10 of those pills today. If you pile tomorrow's pain on top of today's pain, you will OD on trouble. Don't do that. Don't go over your God-given dose of trouble. If you limit yourself to just today's trouble, you might be surprised at how manageable it is, at how well you can handle it if you just take today's trouble by itself. When you have a complex problem, always ask yourself, what portion of this problem, I'm dealing with it today, I'll be dealing with it tomorrow, next year, next month, but ask, what portion of it belongs in today, in the present? Just deal with that part now and not the rest of it. The rest of it, off limits. Off limits. And today's portion is very often a lot smaller than you think. And if you're really overwhelmed, apply that same principle to hours rather than days. What portion of this problem must be handled between now and 60 minutes from now? What does God expect of me in this hour? Each hour has enough trouble of its own. And most of the time, this hour's trouble is, if it's by itself, is quite manageable. So, that's the statement Jesus makes. He says, he gives a command, and then he makes the statement, each day has enough trouble of its own. Now let's look at the promise. Matthew 6:34, do not worry about tomorrow, then here comes the promise, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Kind of a funny promise. I think a lot of people, we overlook this promise because it seems a little strange. It requires some thought to interpret it. What does it mean that tomorrow will worry about itself? Obviously, a day on the calendar can't worry. It's not capable of worry. Only sentient beings can give thoughts to problems, right? So Jesus' point here, when he says tomorrow will worry about itself, what he's saying is the sentient beings that will be there tomorrow, most significantly, you and God, will handle those troubles when those troubles happen. So, you and God. Now let's consider for God's role and your role. First, God's role. When the children of Israel faced the terrifying task of crossing into the promised land and facing all those hostile nations, listen to what God said to calm their fears. Deuteronomy 31:3, he said, the Lord your God himself will cross over ahead of you. He will destroy these nations before you, and you will take possession of their land. Now, usually, when the people were afraid, God would calm their fears by saying, don't worry, I'll be with you. But this time, instead of saying, I'll be with you, he says, no, I'll be out ahead of you. I'm going to go ahead of you. God promises to go out first so that by the time the people arrive, they will find a situation prepared by God in which they will prevail. The implication of Jesus' promise when he says tomorrow will worry about itself is a very similar idea. The Lord is traveling right out ahead of you, about a day's journey ahead of you. All the trouble that you will meet, before you meet it, it will have to encounter God before reaching you, because he's going out ahead of you. As long as you follow at his pace, you'll be fine. But if you use your powers of worry to transport yourself out ahead of him into tomorrow, into the future, you're going to find yourself in a time where God has not yet gone ahead of you and paved the way. Another way to think about it is 1 Kings 17, where God sent Elijah to a place where there was no food. It's like, I'm sending you off there. There's not going to be any food. And then he says this, 1 Kings 17:4, I have ordered the ravens to feed you there. I've ordered don't worry about it. I've made some plans. Whatever desolate place God might be sending you to tomorrow, he'll order the ravens to feed you there when the time comes, when you get there. He will move the very creation to supply your needs. Of course, it looks scary now because God hasn't made those preparations yet. There's no ravens there yet. It's not happening yet. It'll happen when you get there. God is moving at just the right pace. Stay behind him where it's safe. Your life as a whole is a huge task that God has assigned to you. But God has divided that task into very manageable portions called days. Tackle one of those per day, and you'll be right on schedule. And you might hear all that and say, okay, God will go ahead of me and he'll prepare the way. That's wonderful. But he's not going to do everything for me when I get there. I still have to do some things. I mean, that's the part I'm worried about, is I don't know if I'm going to be up to it. I look in the mirror, I see a person that, I don't know if he can handle this, what's coming. Well, that's not a problem, because when the future comes, you're going to be a different person. You're not going to be looking at that same person in the mirror. You know, according to church tradition, the Apostle Peter when he was crucified as a martyr, he asked to be crucified upside down because he wasn't worthy to die the same way his Lord died. Could you do that? Could you do that? I mean, do you think if you were threatened with crucifixion, your faith might falter? Most of us would say, man, I don't know if I would have that kind of courage. Well, if that's you, don't feel bad, because neither did Peter. Neither did Peter until the day came when he needed it. But you look at Peter's life before that, did he have that kind of courage? No. More than once, he proved to be a coward. At Jesus' crucifixion, he's a coward when that girl asked him, do you know him? Again, in Galatians 2, again, coward. But when the ultimate test came, he was strong. He was strong. God will do that for you too. He'll do that for you. He promises, 2 Thessalonians 3:3, the Lord is faithful and he will strengthen and protect you from the evil one. He will. God promises to supply you with all the strength that you're going to need. What else does God promise with regard to your future? Well, in a word, everything. Everything. Philippians 4:19, my God will meet all your needs according to his glorious riches in Christ Jesus. All of them. All of them. Whatever energy you need, whatever wisdom is required, whatever courage, money, experience, friends, resources, God will make everything you need available to you when the time comes. But remember, trusting in any of God's promises begins with trusting in God's perfect timing. His perfect timing. Notice the verb tenses in these promises. The Lord will strengthen you. My God will meet all your needs. These are future tenses, right? If you don't think you could handle your future troubles now, it's probably because you can't. All that grace that's promised is promised in the future. Don't expect it today. Have you ever noticed how the anticipation of trouble is always worse than the trouble itself? I mean, we usually do pretty well handling a crisis. Crisis comes up, we didn't see it coming in, we struggle through it, we handle it, right? But man, when you can see it coming and you're anticipating it, oh man, that's overwhelming. Why? Because God gives you the grace to handle it when it happens, not before. You don't have that grace today. Recent days, Laken Riley has been in the news, 22-year-old nursing student beaten to death by Jose Antonio Ibarra. News stories like that, whenever I hear those always capture my emotions more than most, because for whatever reason, of all the ways to die, that one, being beaten to death, that's the one that's always terrified me the most. It just seems like I could never handle that. Now, will that someday happen to me? Maybe. Hope not, but maybe. If it does, God promises to supply all the grace that I'll need when it happens. But what would that be like? What would it be like to have that kind of grace? I mean, I have no idea. I can't imagine. I can't imagine anything that would make an experience like that bearable. But isn't that exactly what I should expect? That I can't imagine it? Of course I can't imagine it. I don't have the grace to handle it now because it's not happening now. So God hasn't given me that grace, so I can't think of it. If I imagine what it would be like to be beaten to death, the only way I can imagine that is to project today's grace into that day. And I'm like, that's not enough grace. That's not enough strength. Well, of course not. That's today's strength. Another way to think about it, imagine enrolling in college as a math major, and on your very first day, you're sitting in the class and the professor hands out this exam and you look at it and your heart starts beating. You look at everything on the page looks just like gibberish. You can't even understand the questions, much less answer them. And everybody's all nervous. Then the professor explains, says, no. This is the final exam of the highest class that you're going to be taking 4 years from now as a senior. This is the test. I just wanted you to see it. Over the next 4 years, you're going to receive everything you need to be able to pass this test, no problem. And the whole class just breathes a big sigh of relief, like, oh, wow. Why? Well, nothing has really changed, right? You still have to take the test. You're still going to have to pass it. If you took it now, you would for sure fail it. But you're not worried because you know when the time comes, you're going to be ready. Are you worried about the future? It's because you're looking at the final exam and you haven't even taken the class yet. We can actually look forward to the future, trouble and all. Why? Because it'll be full of new grace. It'll be filled with new grace. Look forward to that grace. Isn't that how Jesus taught us to pray? Matthew 6:11, give us this day our daily bread. We might have preferred, give us right now our annual bread, right? So ahead of time. But Jesus taught us to seek from God what we need for each day on the day that it is needed. And Jesus wasn't just speaking about food. Daily bread refers to all our daily needs, including daily strength. Deuteronomy 33:25 says, your strength will equal your days. Isn't that great? Your strength will equal your days. Each time God gives you another day, He's going to give you strength for that day. God taught this principle to His people in the wilderness with the manna. Remember that? He told them, gather whatever you need for today, however much you want for today. Don't try and gather anything for tomorrow. If you do, I'm going to make it go bad overnight. Exodus 16. Why were they tempted to gather extra? Why are you and I tempted to try to seek this grace ahead of time? The strength that we need ahead of time? Well, it's because then we wouldn't have to trust God. We could just rely on our stockpile. Why does God make us wait for tomorrow to receive tomorrow's grace? Well, to force us to always trust in Him, because God knows that the act of trusting Him is more important than all the things we're trusting Him for. Nothing will do you more good than living in the rhythm of daily trust. The rhythm of daily trust. Lamentations 3:23 says His mercies are new every morning. Such a beautiful verse. God wants to experience, He wants us to experience that fresh, recurring, daily newness. He doesn't want us eating stale manna. Enjoy today's grace and look forward to tomorrow for tomorrow's grace. When you wake up tomorrow, brand new grace will be there waiting for you, tailor-made for that day's trouble. Look forward to tomorrow's fresh supply. When you consider tomorrow's trouble and what tomorrow holds, the question isn't whether you'll be able to handle it. The only question is whether you and God will be able to handle it. And the answer to that question is obvious. Will you and God be able to handle it? Well, the answer to that question is obvious. That's why God so often responds to our fears by just telling us, I'll be with you. I'll be with you. And he won't just be there. He'll be there strengthening you. And do you want to hear something really amazing? While God places tomorrow's pain off limits, God has granted us full, unfettered, unrestricted access to tomorrow's joy. Do you know that? You're not permitted to jump the gun on suffering tomorrow's pain, but you are permitted to jump the gun on enjoying all the wonderful things that God has promised in the future, enjoying those now. You can do that. The biblical word for that is hope. It's hope, and it's the exact opposite of worry. Worry is when you feel pain today because of tomorrow's hardship. Hope is when you feel happiness today because of tomorrow's blessings. And if you want to see that shift from worry to hope, you can just read Psalm 131. I have stilled and quieted my soul. Like a weaned child with its mother. Like a weaned child is my soul within me. O Israel, put your hope in the Lord. Hope will quiet your riotous soul. Okay, godliness training exercises for this session on worry. I have 3 of them. First, memorize this verse we talked about, Matthew 6:34. Do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. And number 2, take control of your imagination. Whenever worry arises, whenever you start to feel it, then be real intentional about imagining yourself happy in the Lord during this dreaded event that takes place. Use your imagination. Take control. Commandeer your imagination. That's a really important one. And then number 3, read meditations. These meditations in Deeper Knowledge of God book, numbers 62, 68, 76, 77, 81 through 83, 87, and 89. Those are all about worry, and they'll help you.